When we read the story, knowing McCandless has wrote this himself, it makes you see this story of a woman's empowerment different because suddenly you're seeing it through the perspective of like a male fantasy. Hello and thank you for joining me here today at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura and today I am talking about Poor Things, the book by Alasdair Gray, published in 1992, and I'm comparing it with the movie directed by Yorgos Lanthimos, released in 2023. And then also, yes, my voice is not sounding very good. I'm recovering from being sick yet again, and I probably should wait to film this till my voice sounds better, but with a new release, like, time is of the essence, so I really did want to get this filmed sooner rather than later. But I will begin with a spoiler-free book and movie review, beginning with the book. So I read this book twice in the last month. I read it like on December 1st because I thought I would be seeing this movie on December 8th, however it was a limited release, and I didn't end up seeing it until 3 weeks later. And so when this December 22nd release was coming up, I wanted to read the book yet again because 3 weeks is a long time, and I just really wanted the book to be fresh in my mind. So yeah, I read this twice within a 3-week span, and I loved it both times. So if anything, like, I'm glad I read it a second time because it just made me love the book even more. The fact that it was able to hold up on a second read so soon after I read it once. You know, it was just like so entertaining and funny and thought-provoking and vivid, and the characters were just so memorable and distinct. Alasdair Gray also takes inspiration from a number of like popular Gothic Victorian stories, and he does so in such a clever, witty, self-aware way that I absolutely loved, and it just worked so well. And it is written in a found footage style, which I thought was a cool way to like frame the narrative. We get like a story within historical notes that the person who found these documents added. There's just so many layers to this book. And while I did like this framing device, I did have a couple complaints because at the start of the book, the guy putting together, you know, this found footage, he's including like brief biographies on the different people in the book, like when they were born, when they died, and all this. But going into the book, I didn't know who any of these people were yet. And so a lot of that information just went in one ear and out the other. And so I just didn't find it very necessary. And then also near the end, it seems like he got a bit too carried away with this style because at the end of like the main narrative we then get a section where like the editor, Alasdair Gray, he takes sections from the book and then he comments like and gives historical notes on this phrase or this wording. And I just found it unnecessary. I was just kind of skimming through, to be totally honest, up until we get to the last section of this, where he talks about Bella Baxter and later in life and her death. And so that part is crucial to read. If you read the book, comment your thoughts down below on this found footage style. And on to the movie review. So I will just get the obvious out of the way first and say how incredible Emma Stone is here. Like, she is amazing as Bella, and her character changes so much throughout the course of the movie, but her evolution is seamless. And this is also a very physical role, and her like mannerisms and movements were just perfect. And then also her comedic timing is spot on, and the emotional scenes were so powerful, which that aspect didn't like surprise me because, I mean, who could forget how funny yet heartfelt her performance in Easy A was, right? That movie is so good. So yeah, I do love Emma Stone, but this definitely was very different for her. I should caveat, I have not seen The Favorite, which is also directed by Yorgos Lanthimos and stars Emma Stone, so I am curious to watch that now. But the rest of the cast as well is fantastic. Mark Ruffalo is probably the next standout here, and he just has so many scenes that are just like ridiculous and hilarious, and his character again is just so distinct and memorable. And yet at the same time, like, as ridiculous as his character is, there are times, especially early on, where he is actually like kind of charming in his way, and you can see why Bella is like so taken with him initially. And then this movie also has like a magical realism element to it with like the way the cities look. Like, it looks Victorian, and yet there's like the futuristic aspect, so like steampunk magical realism. And I did hear that Lanthimos made like everything so vibrant because that is how Bella is seeing the world, right? Because it's her first time seeing everything, so it is just like so much more vibrant and magical than it is to the normal person. But yeah, that was such a nice touch. And also, like, this movie is kind of broken up based on locations as she travels, and each title card showing the name of the city, the background is like this moving image of Bella like doing something, and it's just like so surreal and beautiful and weird. And then something else I have never seen in another movie are just the way the camera lenses are constantly changing in this movie. Like, you get cool camera angles, but it's like the lenses and like, I don't know the technical how it's done, but whatever he's doing with the lenses to make the shot look weird and different, it was just really cool. So many just like absolutely beautiful shots in this movie. It is just visually stunning, and the costumes and the makeup are fantastic, and it is just like a beautiful visual feast. Also, the score was amazing and just so perfect, like so intense and bold at times, and also just kind of weird, and it just perfectly fit the movie, and I absolutely loved that too. And then, like the book, the movie is also just like very funny at times while also being very thought-provoking. I will say there was a lot of sex in the film, and I get that Bella's sexual awakening and women's sexuality is just a huge theme of this movie. It's a huge theme in the book, and I know I might sound like a prude when I say this, but I feel like the movie could have had half as many sex scenes and we still would have got the message. And it's not like nudity in and of itself that I don't like, it's just the sex scenes. It was just too much. Like, it's possible to make a movie that embraces, you know, female empowerment and women's sexuality without having so many of these scenes. But that's just my opinion. Comment your thoughts down below. And while this movie does make a fair number of changes to the book, including one huge aspect in regards to the ending, which I will be getting into, nonetheless, I do think this was a solid adaptation. And from here on out, I will be getting into the details of the plot, which means we will have spoilers going forward. So beginning with the basic plot, for those who do not know, so this is the story of Bella Baxter, who is a woman that is created, in a sense, by the scientist / Dr. Godwin Baxter, whom Bella refers to as God. And in both, she had originally been a woman named Victoria Blessington, who, when she was nearly 9 months pregnant, commits suicide by jumping off of a bridge, and Godwin gets her body, and he decides to bring her back to life, but he doesn't want to bring her back to life with her original brain, because she was a woman who wanted to end her life, right? So he's like, if I bring her back, like, she's not going to be happy. And so he takes the brain of the baby and puts it in the head of Victoria, turning her into Bella. And her mental growth does happen at a quick pace, like faster than the growth of a child, right? But for quite a while, she does behave like a child as she is like discovering her body and the world around her. And another doctor named Archie McCandless in the book, but in both book and movie, he is referred to as Candle, so I'm just going to call him Candle as well. So Bella meets him, and the two of them quickly become engaged. However, she decides that before she marries Candle, she first wants to explore the world with a scoundrel she has met named Duncan Wedderburn. And through their travels, Bella continues to learn and grow and mature, and Duncan, meanwhile, is just like run ragged by her. And he is a gambler, and he ends up like losing all of his money, all of his savings. But Bella still has money, so she is able to buy him a ticket, and she's just kind of done with him anyway. So she buys him a ticket, sends him back home, and he ends up in a mental institution. And while she had been with Duncan, she had befriended a madame of a brothel, and so once Duncan leaves, like, she has no money, and so she becomes a prostitute in order to make her way. And she doesn't look down on this job because, again, she doesn't have the conventional ideas of what is like appropriate in society. And she also enjoys sex, so she's like, if I can get paid for this, then that's awesome. And Bella, like, not knowing social conventionality, whatever, like, is a huge part as to why the book and movie are funny, because she doesn't know what's polite and what's decent. But then as she matures, she still doesn't care what is polite or decent, and she still does what she wants. And so it starts out as something that's funny, but as the story progresses, that aspect of her not caring about what society thinks is what makes the movie like so powerful, because to see someone just fully embrace who they are, and they're not ashamed, they go after their wants and their desires, they are just unapologetically themselves and don't care what people think, right? Like, that's just so inspiring to see. But anyway, she eventually does return home, and she is about to marry Candle, who she has been engaged to this whole time. However, at their wedding, her original husband from when she was Victoria Blessington shows up, because in both, Duncan has like contacted the Blessingtons and told them, because during their travels, someone called her Victoria Blessington. Anyway, so because of that, the husband shows up at the wedding and things come to a halt. But from here, the book and movie are different. So as far as like the endings go, I will save that for later in the video. And now I want to talk about Godwin Baxter. So in the book, Godwin kind of looks like the Frankenstein monster. And in the book, it is also just like straight up implied. It's not said, but it's heavily implied that Godwin is a creation, that his quote unquote father, who was a famous scientist and doctor, it's heavily implied that he was created by this man. He's like very large in the book, and he also just has a hideous appearance, and his voice is like very grating and hard to hear. And then also he has trouble eating, which we see in the movie as well. He needs like this mechanism to help him like digest and eat food. And this is something that has gone into in both book and movie. But in the movie, the reason it says he looks the way he does is not because he was a creation of his father, but because his father would experiment on him. And that is why he is the way he is now. And in the book, he says that he created Bella because he wanted female companionship. And he is unable to be aroused unless he is with a woman who like stimulates him mentally for like days on end. And also a woman who doesn't find him hideous, right? Which is hard to come by because most women do find him hideous. And so because of this, he creates Bella. And for a long time, she is the only man he ever sees. And so he is very normal to her and she is not disgusted by him. And when Candle meets Bella and Godwin tells him like why he created her and his intentions, Candle says, "You think you are about to possess what men have hopelessly yearned for throughout the ages, the soul of an innocent, trusting, dependent child inside the opulent body of a radiantly lovely woman." And in the book, Bella and Candle get engaged. And when Bella tells Godwin this, he has a scream that is like so piercing that Bella faints. You know, he created Bella to be with him. So the fact that now she is choosing to be with another man, like he can't bear it. And he asks them to at least wait 2 weeks before they get married. And during this 2-week time, Godwin had planned on ending his life because he just couldn't bear the thought of Bella being with another man. However, you know, she doesn't marry Candle at that time. She instead goes off with Duncan. And so Godwin doesn't end his life. This is very different in the movie though, because in the movie, Godwin has like no sexual interest in Bella whatsoever. And he is in fact the one who tells Candle like, hey, like you and Bella should get married. In the movie, he is more controlling of her, I would say, because he hardly lets her go outside. Whereas in the book, soon after her creation, he takes her on like a year-long tour of the world. And yeah, he might be like around her a lot of the time and not let her out of his sight to some extent. Nonetheless, she still does get some freedom and she sees the whole world, which was not the case in the movie at all. And in the movie, when she tells Godwin that she is going to leave with Duncan, he wants to try to stop her, but she tells him like, if you don't let me do this, I'm going to be filled with resentment and hate for you. And so Godwin realizes that it's in his best interest to let her go and he like gives her his blessing. Whereas in the book, she didn't say that to him. Like he knew that he couldn't stop her because he valued their relationship. So he's like, I don't want her to go, but I'm not going to try to stop her either. He does get Candle to try to stop her, but in both book and movie, she chloroforms Candle so that she can get away. But a quote that Godwin says about Bella in the book reads, "Her menstrual cycle was in full flood from the day she opened her eyes, so she has never been taught to feel her body is disgusting or to dread what she desires. Not having learned cowardice when small and oppressed, she only uses speech to say what she thinks and feels, not to disguise these, so she is incapable of every badness done through hypocrisy and lying, nearly every sort of badness. All she lacks is experience, especially the experience of decision-making." So he is saying this when she has decided to go with Duncan because he's like, hey, this will help her experience decision-making, so it's a good thing. But while she is away on her travels, growing and experiencing all of these things, she writes letters to Godwin and Candle, which they read. And as Godwin is reading these letters, he's just so proud of her. And in the book, he says, "I read Genesis 3 years ago and could not understand God's displeasure when even Adam chose to know good and evil, chose to be godlike. That should have been his proudest hour. They deliberately disobeyed him, I said. He had given them life and everything they could enjoy, everything on earth except 2 forbidden trees. Those were sacred mysteries whose fruit did harm. Nothing but perverse greed made them eat it." Baxter shook his head and said, "Only bad religions depend on mysteries, just as bad governments depend on secret police. Truth, beauty, and goodness are not mysterious. They are the commonest, most obvious, most essential facts of life, like sunlight, air, and bread. Only folks whose heads are muddled by expensive educations think truth, beauty, and goodness are rare private properties. Nature is more liberal. The universe keeps nothing essential from us. It is all present, all gift. God is the universe plus mind. Those who say God or the universe or nature is mysterious are like those who call these things jealous or angry. They are announcing the state of their lonely, muddled minds." And I thought that was such a great section. And like, I agree. I don't think God was upset when Adam and Eve chose to eat of the fruit of knowledge to know good and evil. Like, I think that was a proud moment. Like, they're using their agency. They're making their own choices. They're wanting knowledge. Like, yeah, I think that was a good thing. And it was something essential and important that had to happen. And yet so many Bible-based religions see it as like a horrible thing and it wasn't supposed to happen and it was terrible. And I just think that's so unfortunate because it perpetuates so many ideas of God that I don't think are true. And it also perpetuates ideas about Eve being evil and tempting Adam, which is kind of something we'll get into later here. But yeah, that's just my opinion. So share your thoughts down below in the comments on that. But also to go along with like knowing the good and bad in life. In the movie, there is a part when the woman who owns the brothel talks to Bella saying like, it's important to experience the good and the bad. Like you need all of that to be like a complete human and to experience the full scope of life. You know, you can't just experience pleasure, right? You need to experience pain as well. And in the book, Bella also kind of has this viewpoint because when she is talking to Godwin about Duncan, like she knows Duncan is a scoundrel. And yet we read, and this is Godwin talking to Candle about what Bella told him about Duncan. She told me how evil and treacherous he is. The cunning fiend has seduced her with accounts of his debaucheries with all the women he has cheated and betrayed. And not just women, McCandless. He has indulged in an orgy of confession. She says it was as good as a book. And of course he declares that love of her has purified his life and made a new man of him, and he will never abandon her. I asked her if she believed this. She said not much, but nobody had ever abandoned her before, and the change might do her good. And then to talk about Bella. So in the book, Duncan points out the scar on her stomach showing that she had like a C-section and she therefore had had a baby. And so she begins to start to wonder about this because she doesn't have any memory of her past life, her childhood or anything. And Godwin has told her that her parents died in an accident and she too was in an accident and it gave her amnesia. So her like missing childhood and not knowing is a huge part of the book. Like the movie too, but I feel like it's focused on more in the book. And so this idea that she like once had a baby, she's just like, well, where is my baby? Like what happened to her? And so she starts to wonder that and it becomes a big part of the book. Whereas in the movie, it's not until like later where a woman she has a relationship with points out the scar, being like, oh, you've had a baby. And Bella dismisses it, being like, oh, that's like from an accident I was in. But the woman is like, I mean, why are you lying? Like clearly you had a baby. And so again, this causes Bella to start thinking and wondering about this. And in both, as she is starting to learn and grow, she's on a ship with Duncan and she meets these two other people who talk about philosophy and politics and other things that are just beginning to really interest Bella. And Bella has a very optimistic view of the world at this point because she has no reason not to. And so the men decide that they are going to show her how cruel the world can be. And in the movie, this is specifically the man named Astley. In the book, it's Astley as well. Anyway, he takes her to Alexandria in both book and movie. And in the book, she sees like a blind woman with like a blind baby, I think, and they're like starving and begging for food. In the movie, they're at a restaurant in Alexandria, like up high, and he takes her to the balcony and has her look down to like the slums where these people are sick and dying and starving. And in both, like she is just so distraught by this and like she's running and wanting to do something. And in both, Astley, he like puts his hand over her mouth and she bites his hand. And it's just like a very difficult moment in both book and movie. And by the way, in the movie, having them be up at that restaurant, then looking down on the people suffering, like that was just such a great visual. And yeah, in both, this makes Bella like want to help people and to find a way to help and to stop this suffering. But Astley in the book and movie, he tells her like, no, like there's nothing you can do. There's nothing anybody can do. And in the movie, I think maybe the book too, but I don't remember. But in the movie, Astley tells her that the reason he did that, like it wasn't because he wanted to help her. He admits like, I did that because your positivity bothered me and I wanted to hurt you. And then she says of him in both book and movie, how she sees that he is just a hurt boy who can't stand the suffering in the world. And so he therefore has chosen to be a cynic. And in the book, she befriends Astley as well as another man. And so it's these two men who like teach Bella. Whereas in the movie, it is an older woman who is traveling with Astley. And this woman was hilarious in the movie. I absolutely loved her. And just the friendship she has with Bella was fantastic. And there was a part where Duncan is upset with Bella that she like has more interest in books and talking philosophy than she has with him. And he also says like, oh, you don't talk in that cute way you used to, because she used to talk like a child. And by the way, like I talk about the Born Sexy Yesterday trope in my time machine video, so you definitely should watch that. But this book and movie do such a great job like showing that trope of Born Sexy Yesterday, but like kind of flipping it on its head, right? Because eventually Bella, she loses the Born Yesterday part and she starts to realize like, wait, what am I doing? Why am I listening to this man who is being like so controlling and so prideful and who isn't as smart as he thinks he is? And just showing like how manipulative the man is in that trope, right? Because these men prey on women in these stereotypes. They prey on the women who are like too stupid and naive and don't know any better, which Bella was very naive when she met Duncan initially. But again, she grows and matures as time goes on and she outgrows him. Anyway, so he's upset at this woman because she's getting Bella into reading. And so there's a part where he's like, I'm going to throw her overboard. And this was such a hilarious scene because obviously he doesn't succeed. But when he says he's going to toss her overboard, the woman's reaction, she's like, oh, I never thought my life would end in murder. Like, how exciting. And in the book, Bella's desire to help those who are suffering, the various men that she is talking to about this, they all say that her desire to help others is her displaced motherhood, and she simply needs to have a child, and then that desire will be fulfilled, which she is obviously very bothered by, right? Because it is men's way of dismissing the fact that she wants to do something more in the world. And I get being a mom does help change the world and make it better. But to say that that's like all a woman can do is just be a mom is very sexist. And when she returns to Godwin in book and movie, she asks him like, what happened to my baby? And in the book, he is like very overwhelmed and he doesn't know how to respond, but he is able to tell her with the help of Candle. He lies and he says that the baby died in the accident that gave her amnesia. Whereas in the movie, Godwin is on his deathbed. So when she returns, she asks him and he tells her the truth, that she is both mother and child. And then to talk about the movie ending, so once she returns, she still wants to marry Candle. In the movie, like he doesn't hold her to it because obviously she is so much more mature now. And he's like, our engagement, like you were a child then, so you do not need to feel the need, to fulfill that commitment. But she sees that Candle is like different from other men and she does want to marry him. So she proposes to him and he says yes. And so they go to the chapel to be married. And then suddenly her former husband, Blessington, shows up and he says that he wants to take her back home. And in the movie, she agrees, which kind of surprised me, but not really because Bella, one, she is curious, right? And she wants to see things through and see where something will lead. But also she has just realized that she had a whole nother life and she was a whole nother person at one point. And so I think she also like wants to feel more full and to understand herself more. And so by going with her former husband, it gives her the chance to find out about herself, right? That self-discovery. But when she goes back to stay with him, we see that he is a horrible person and he like has guns held on the staff at all times because he doesn't trust them. And he's also a huge bully who plays mean jokes on the staff. And he tells her like, you used to enjoy this. You found this funny too, showing that she too had been a cruel person. And he claims that the reason she jumped off the bridge was because she was unhappy that she was pregnant and did not want to be a mother, which obviously there could have been more to it, right? Like he doesn't seem trustworthy, but that's what he claims. But when Bella sees that like this guy sucks, she's like, you know what? Actually, I'm going to go back to Godwin now. I've got what I needed here and I'm ready to leave. But he tells her like, if you try to leave, I will shoot you. But soon after this, it's like the next day, she overhears him talking to a doctor saying that they are going to perform a clitoridectomy on her. And the night before, she had told him that she worked in a brothel because she knows most men are really bothered by that. So she tells him being like, hey, like, just so you know, this is what I was doing. And he doesn't really care, but he does say like, oh, you always had like an unhealthy sexual appetite. So that doesn't surprise me. So he wants her to get this procedure done. So one, she won't be as sexual, but two, they also say that it makes women more docile when they get this done. She later confronts him about all of this. And long story short, he pulls a gun on her, but in some commotion, he ends up shooting himself in the foot, which I thought was a good visual representation of the phrase, shoot yourself in the foot. But anyway, and so he is bleeding to death from his foot. So she takes him back to Godwin's home, which is now her home because Godwin is dead. And so with the help of Candle, they stitch up his foot to stop him from dying. But because he's such a horrible person, they replace his brain with the brain of a goat. And then the movie ends with her and Candle living in like Godwin's mansion with all of their strange creations. And she is studying to become a doctor. And also the woman she'd had a relationship with, she is now here living with Bella as well. And that is how the movie ends. But I do want to circle back real quick to Bella when she realizes that she had been a cruel person when she was Victoria, because I think there's a lot that we could get into there. Like in a way, she killed her former self so that she could become a new and better version of herself. Obviously, Victoria didn't know she would be reborn in a better way. She just thought she was ending her life. But just the symbolism of that, right? Like ending one side of who you are so that you could become someone else. And then the realization that her old self had been really cruel, like even though that would be hard to realize, at the same time, I think finding that out about herself kind of helps her feel more full, right? Because now she knows. And yeah, I think there's like a lot we could get into there, but I'm just gonna leave it there for now. Comment your thoughts down below on that. But to move on to the book ending, so in the book, she is getting married to Candle. Their wedding day is on Christmas Day, by the way, so this is kind of a Christmas story. But anyway, they're at the chapel to get married when her former husband shows up, as well as her father, as well as an investigator and maybe other people too. And they're like, hey, stop the wedding. That's Victoria Blessington. And in the book, Godwin is like, you know what, let's all go back to my place and we can talk about this. And so they go back to Godwin's home and then they all hear the story of Bella's creation. And this is Bella's first time hearing this. Remember in the book, she had not known. So she's realizing the truth of who she is. And she also learns the truth about her as Victoria Blessington, and her reasons for committing suicide were different because in the book, her husband had found her sexual desires like disgusting, and he would only lay with her like on occasion. And yet we find out that he'd had a mistress who he would see multiple times a week. And so Bella is just like, what? Like, as Victoria, I was begging you to show me love and you refused, and yet you were meeting up with this other woman. But the husband convinces Victoria that she needs to get this procedure done so that it will tame her sexual desires. However, at this point she was pregnant, and so they say that she has to wait until after she has the baby. And when talking about Victoria's sexual desires, the husband says, no normal healthy woman, no good or sane woman wants or expects to enjoy sexual contact except as a duty. Even pagan philosophers knew that men are energetic planters and women are peaceful fields. Only debauched females wriggle their hips. And these two women, Victoria and then the woman the husband was having an affair with, like the way he sees the two of them is such a great example of how women in general are seen. Like, it's either one, they are like these pure, innocent, ladylike, polite people who don't enjoy sex and aren't sexual at all, or they're the type of woman who is only seen as a sexual object, and it's like those two extremes. When obviously every woman is more nuanced than that, of course. And I know that seems obvious to say, but like back in the day that wasn't obvious, and it was like one or the other. And even today we do still see this. And so even though I say that it's obvious to say that that's not the case, we still kind of see that to this day still. But anyway, Victoria is pregnant, but also the mistress becomes pregnant as well. But the husband like leaves the mistress behind because he's done with her, and she's upset. So she goes to see Victoria and she tells Victoria everything. And Victoria becomes upset and she causes a scene in the street and stuff. And so Blessington takes her and locks her in the coal cellar. However, the staff liked Victoria, so they let her out, and she goes to her father for help, but the father is no help whatsoever, and he doesn't want to get involved, and he thinks Victoria should get this procedure. And he also says, like, he's so condescending because he says how like he doesn't like being around hysterical women and he just wanted her out of his sight. And she was also nearly 9 months pregnant, and he was like, I didn't want to risk you like having the baby right then and there because that's just disgusting and I don't want to see that. And he literally treats her as an animal because he puts her on a train and he says, I charged off in case you pupped on the station platform. And so after this, she then takes a train to Glasgow or wherever, and she jumps off the bridge. And so after Bella hears all of this, you know, she has a phrase where she says like, a life without freedom is not a life at all. And so she's like, I'm not going to go back with you. Like, I don't care that rumors are spreading. Like, I'm staying here. And as in the movie, Blessington does pull a gun out. However, it's different because like Victoria or Bella grabs the gun and it ends up shooting her own foot. However, you know, Blessington, he ends up leaving, but then like a week later, they find out that he has ended his own life. And since he is no longer alive, Bella can now marry Candle, and they do. Godwin ends up dying. She and Candle end up having 3 sons, and Bella becomes like an incredibly, supremely successful doctor. But now on to the book twist, because there is an added element to the book where, you know, it's written in the found footage style, and this main story we've been reading was put together by Archie McCandless. He put together this document, including letters from Bella that just tell this whole story. But after we read that initial story, we then get a section written by Bella. She reads this book after Candle has died, and then she shares her perspective on it. And she says that the book is false and that her husband was basically like a pathetic person, and he wrote this book as a way to like make himself feel better and more important than he really was. But she says, according to her account, that she met Godwin because she was married to her husband, who was very cruel, and he wanted her to get the procedure done. And the doctor they had come in was Godwin. And when Godwin talks to her, he tells her like, hey, like there's nothing wrong with you. Like, you do not need this procedure done. Like, you're fine. It's the men who you are surrounded with who are bad, terrible people convincing you of things that aren't true. And so Bella Victoria is like so grateful to him, and she starts to fall in love with him. And so a few weeks later, she leaves her husband and she shows up at Godwin's door and he takes her in. And then she later meets Candle when he comes to visit. And in the original story, Candle and Godwin, they butted heads at times, but for the most part, it seems like they were close. Whereas according to Bella's account, Godwin didn't like Candle. And when they meet, Candle is instantly smitten with Bella, but Bella has like zero interest. And then in both, she does travel with Duncan, and he does end up in an insane asylum in her version as well. But ultimately, she decides she's going to marry Candle because she knows he is into her, and she also sees that he is spineless. And so she's like, I'm in love with Godwin still. Like, Godwin doesn't want to be with me romantically, but I love him and I respect him and I admire him. So I want to stay living with him. So I will marry a man who is spineless and will allow that. And so she marries Candle, and She's able to pursue her career aspirations and live with Godwin while being married to him. But she says that Candle was jealous of the love that she and Godwin had, especially her love for Godwin, right? But he was also jealous of their childhoods because Archie McCandless was born in a very poor home. And so we read, and this is Bella talking of Candle. So in his last months, he soothed himself by imagining a world where he and God and I existed in perfect equality. Having a childhood which privileged people would have thought no childhood, he wrote a book suggesting that God had none either. That God had always been as Archie knew him because Sir Colin had manufactured God by the Frankenstein method. Then he deprived me of a childhood and schooling by suggesting that I was not mentally me when I first met him, but my baby daughter. Having invented this equality of deprivation for all of us, he could then easily describe how I loved him at first sight and how Godwin envied him. And after telling us her account of her life, she writes, "You, dear reader, have now two accounts to choose between, and there can be no doubt which is most probable. My second husband's story positively stinks of all that was morbid in the most morbid of centuries, the 19th. He has made a sufficiently strange story stranger still by stirring into it episodes and phrases to be found in Hogg's Suicide's Grave and additional ghouleries found from works of Mary Shelley and Edgar Allan Poe. What morbid Victorian fantasy has he not filched from? I find traces of The Coming Race, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Dracula, Trilby, Rider Hagrid's She, The Casebook of Sherlock Holmes, and alas, Alice Through the Looking Glass, a gloomier book than the sunlit Alice in Wonderland. He has even plagiarized work by two very dear friends, G.B. Shaw's Pygmalion and Scientific Romances of Herbert George Wells." And also I would say like there's some Jane Eyre aspects to this as well. But then after we read Bella's part, this is where the collector of these documents, he then is like going through and filling us in on like different historical facts about the time and things. And then he tells us about Bella later in life and her death. And in this scene, we find out that when she died, she had the body of a 92-year-old, but her brain, in her autopsy, her brain was only 66 years old. So yeah, suddenly you're like, wait, like what? What's true and what isn't? And it's funny because at the start of the book, we hear from Victoria McCandless dismissing what we are about to read, right? But honestly, I kind of forgot about that. So as I was reading, I was thinking it was true. But then we get the part where Victoria Bella says like, no, like this is false. But then we get a part that says like historical documents prove that her brain was 30 years younger than her body. So I think ultimately, like, Candle was still an unreliable narrator and he is still telling Bella's story through a man's perspective, right? But it does have some truth to it. But then also you have Bella's story and she doesn't believe that she was created by Godwin, and obviously she has this whole other backstory. So did she just like subconsciously reject what she found out, and over time she kind of forgot about it and created her own delusion as to what happened? I don't know. It's so interesting. And again, when we read the story, knowing McCandless has wrote this himself and he fabricated parts of it, it makes you see this story of a woman's empowerment different because suddenly you're seeing it through the perspective of like a male fantasy. And yeah, this book, it just has so many layers to it and it makes for such a complex, thought-provoking book. But to talk about the female empowerment aspect, so this is obviously a big theme of the book and movie, female empowerment, embracing female sexuality, and a female being her own autonomous person who should be allowed to make her own choices. And the men in Bella's life are always trying to control her and get her to behave in ways that are found appropriate for a woman in society. Because in the movie, Godwin, he doesn't care about Bella's agency or her right to choose, really. And then Duncan likes her best when she is ignorant and naive. Like, he literally tells her to get into a trunk, and she does. And the reason he has her put in a trunk is because he wants her to stop, like, going out and exploring and being with men other than him. So he literally gets her to go in a trunk, and then he keeps her on there, and he doesn't open it until they're on the ship. But then her Victoria Blessington, her husband, he literally keeps her prisoner, wanting to control her, as well as disfigure her in order to make her more docile and ladylike. And then, of course, all of these men are disgusted with her free love attitude of her body. Even though it's her body, they think that they should be in control of what she does or doesn't do with it. With Duncan putting her in a trunk, like, again, this was another great visual representation of Duncan literally putting Bella in a box, right? Because we, like, figuratively put people in a box thinking, like, this is who you are, this is how you need to behave, this is what you need to be, and it's our way of, like, wanting to control people and get them to be the way we think they should be. And again, it's just like so great to see Bella just like unabashedly be herself and just not care what other people think. And it was just great to see. And Mariana from Impression Blend has a movie review for this, and she talks about like what the title means, like who are the poor things? And she says how the poor things are those in Bella's life who are uncomfortable with who she is, and those who feel the need to try to make her to conform to society, and they themselves also conform to society because they want to fit in in, and so they don't allow themselves to be themselves. And so they are the poor things because they are trying to control her while also repressing who they are. But when she works in the brothel in the movie, the men choose which women they want, and she suggests, like, how about the women choose? That would be better. But of course, this doesn't go over well. However, like, she decides she's going to make her own changes, and so when she has a John come up, she first has him share a childhood memory, and then she tells him a joke, and this creates like a bond between them, and the scene we get of this in the movie, like, it actually was really sweet, which is funny to say considering the situation. But I do have my complaints with how this whole thing is portrayed specifically in the movie, and I did watch another movie review video by YouTuber Alasdair Queen, and her video was really interesting because she didn't like this movie, and she talks about how, like, it feels like the male fantasy version of what women's liberation looks like, which is funny because that's what the book was to some extent, right? But she also says how, like, it came too easy for Bella. Like, she never suffers herself. She sees suffering and she has empathy, but she herself never suffers. And then also her time working in the brothel also comes across like the male fantasy of what they think it would be like, and it wasn't like the harsh reality of what that would actually be. And that is a pet peeve of mine when, like, sex work is romanticized. And in the book, she didn't enjoy this job as much as she did in the movie, but in the book, she just talks about how it was, like, very unsatisfying, essentially. So since recording the main part of this video, I have been thinking how, like, Alachia's video saying how, like, if a woman wants to be liberated, but she's not, it's her own fault because she simply needs to just go for it and try, and she can easily achieve it. And so I do think, in a sense, you know, Alachia, she does have a valid complaint. Like, no, it wouldn't be as easy as it is for Bella in this movie. And yet at the same time, I was thinking that, you know, it's kind of nice though to see a movie where a woman wants to change something in society that society just readily accepts. And she's like, you know what? No, like, that seems wrong. I'm going to make a change. And she does make the changes and she does succeed. You know, the patriarchy isn't able to stop her from being this incredible, groundbreaking woman who breaks free of the conventions of society. I don't know if I'm interested in seeing a movie about a woman who tries to do this and yet is just pushed back down and she is stopped from achieving her goals, right? Like, that's just kind of a downer, which sometimes, you know, I'm in the mood for something a bit more gritty and maybe something that is more of a downer. And yet at the same time, like, I'm glad movies like this exist where they are more uplifting in a way, even if it is more fantastical. And I do think we could have seen Bella struggle a bit more because I do agree that everything happens so easily for her in a lot of ways. But nonetheless, the more I think about it, I have decided that it's nice to see a story where things work out so well for the female character. And of this part of the book, the fact that it is a man's fantasy version of women's liberation, someone commented on that video and they said, at the end of the book, when we actually hear from Bella herself, it becomes very clear that most of what you just read was in fact a fantasy, and the fantasy of a man nonetheless. And the whole story is really a critique on the male fantasy of a sexually liberated woman rather than it is a story of an actual woman, liberated or not. The contrast between the real Bella, who spent her life educating women and writing pamphlets on reproductive health, and the fantasy Bella conjured up by the men who knew her, who are of course the ones given the platform to tell her story, is a stark one. And yeah, I'm going to link to Mariana's video as well as Alachia's video because both of them have very different takes on the movie, and I thought it was just really interesting to hear both of their thoughts. I feel like I'm somewhere in between, but most people are gushing about this movie, so again, like, hearing someone's critiques I thought was really interesting. And when I left the theater, to be honest, I was like, that seems like a 3.5-star movie, which is kind of low. But then after I was reading what other people said who loved it, I was like, okay, you know, maybe it's 4 stars. But yeah, initially I wasn't as crazy about this as a lot of people were. And so hearing someone voice their complaints with it kind of helped me figure out, like, what was it that I didn't love about this, you know? Before I wrap things up, there are a few other things I want to talk about, specifically Duncan. So in the movie, Duncan wins a ton of money gambling, but then Bella, she has just seen the poor people in Alexandria, so she takes his money to give it to them. However, she gives it to 2 guys who work on the ship, and they're like, oh, don't worry, we'll give it to them. But of course, we can assume that they keep it for themselves. But this is what causes them to be broke, and they go to Paris, and in Paris, they have no money, and Bella sees it as like, you know, this is exciting, this is interesting, this is life experience, whereas Duncan is miserable. But in the movie from here, this is her first time getting a John and being paid, and when Duncan finds out that's how she got the money, he is like disgusted and wants nothing to do with her. Whereas in the book, he wins a ton of money, but then she knows he's going to keep gambling and lose it, so she takes some of the money herself and hides it, and then he does continue to gamble and he does lose it all, and rather than tell him like, it's okay, you lost it because I saved some, instead she acts like, oh no, like this is horrible. She's like, I'll get us money, just give me 2 hours. And so she's gone for 2 hours, and when she comes back, she acts as though she had to do something horrible to get the money. And when he says like, oh, what did you do? How did you get this money? She's like, never ask. And she's very dramatic. But really, it's the money that Duncan won that she had taken. But Duncan, he is like so wrought with guilt that he has led Bella to do this and thinks he's a horrible person. However, Bella eventually tells him like, no, I didn't do that. Like I took the money that you had won and I hid it. And then he totally flips on her and he's like, oh, you're a horrible woman. I can't believe this. And eventually in the book, like he thinks Bella is a witch and she is evil, and he compares her to Eve and other people, like these evil women who caused the demise of strong men. And he ends up going to a mental institution, as I said in the book, but he like writes to Godwin saying like how evil Bella is. And then he writes to the Blessingtons as well. Whereas in the movie, so he leaves her after he finds out how she got the money in the movie, but then he still can't get over her. And even though she's like done with him, he keeps coming back like begging for her to return to him. And so this was a big difference too, because in the book, Duncan may still have been obsessed with her in a weird way, but he wasn't trying to get her back. And so this again is like a trope that other YouTuber Alasdair talked about, where the woman cast aside the man, but he's so desperate to get her back. Although I will say I did appreciate the Streetcar Named Desire reference. But in Bella's version as well in the book, she says after her time with Duncan, he still went into a mental asylum. And she says in the book, well, I enjoyed my Wedderburn while he lasted and was gentle with him when he fell apart. I still visited him once a month in the lunatic asylum. He is bright and cheerful and always greets me with a mischievous wink and knowing grin. I am sure his insanity began as a pretense to evade imprisonment for embezzling clients' funds, but it is real enough now. And then some other quick changes I want to talk about. So in the book, she is kicked out of the brothel because a doctor comes to check them for diseases. And she's like, what? Like, this is messed up. Like, we should check the men for diseases, not the woman. And she causes a scene and the doctor is upset and she's kicked out. Whereas in the book, she leaves because she gets a letter saying that Godwin is sick. And so that's why she leaves to go back home. And also a big change in the movie, Godwin, he reaches out to Candle and he's like, hey, I have a job for you. I have this woman. I want you to document her mental and physical progress. Whereas in the book, he and Candle were like fellow students and they did have a kind of a friendship because they were both outcasts for their own reasons. However, like Godwin eventually tells him he doesn't want Candle in his life anymore. And it's like coincidence that Candle runs into them again. And then Godwin just wants someone to talk about Bella to. And then also a big change in the movie, while Bella is off with Duncan, Candle and Godwin create another woman. They like bring her back to life, but it seems like she still has her same brain, so she isn't quite as special as Bella had been. But this is very different because in the book, they didn't create a second woman. That did not happen. And also Godwin, like he goes through phases where he regrets what he has done and he feels like he's a terrible person. So in the book, I don't think Godwin even would have considered making a second woman the way they do in the movie. But onto book versus movie. So again, having Bella say that everything Candle wrote was basically false, or at least in large part fabricated. But then at the end, finding out that her brain really was 30 years younger though, again, it just is so much complexity and so much to think about and so many layers. And I do love stories with unreliable narrator, so I do love that aspect as well. And again, I'm repeating myself, but like the way he talks about the Born Sexy Yesterday trope, obviously it wasn't called that at this time, but that's basically what it is, in which the movie does keep that part, which I really liked the way they do that, like exposing the trope for what it is, the way I talked about earlier in the video. But with the fact that we don't find out that the whole story was told from a man's perspective, and also like McCandless in his story, he doesn't achieve much in life because he's just content being the husband of Bella Baxter, who is so famous. Whereas in Bella's story, she's like, my husband didn't achieve much because he was lazy and he wasn't very smart. But yeah, so it's interesting the differences there, right? Like the movie is more straightforward and leaves out those layers, which in some ways maybe makes a better movie. In some ways they fit their mediums, right? Like with a book, it is more fitting for a book to have all these layers more so than a movie, because a movie you don't want it to be too complicated. So yeah, I feel like ultimately I'm gonna say the book wins, because the book for sure, 4.5 stars, I loved it. Whereas the movie, I keep going back and forth. Like I would still give it 3.5 to 4 stars, but maybe it's too early to be saying because I just can't decide fully what I think of this movie. Like, so I still need to sit on this movie and really think about it and decide what I feel. But I definitely didn't instantly love it as much as I instantly loved the book. So for that reason, I'm going to say the book wins. So comment your thoughts down below. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you found it interesting, and share your thoughts again on the movie and the book. And I've mentioned the time machine, so I will link that in the description. But here on the screen, I will link to my Frankenstein book versus movie, because obviously this story takes a lot from Frankenstein. So if you want more content, I will link to that. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do so, and go ahead and give this a thumbs up as well, and share it if you found it interesting. And thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.